Shalom, I'm Messianic Pastor Michael Brown, and I want to welcome you to session 32 of this series, Messiah Yeshua's Life, a Messianic Jewish Perspective Based on a Harmony of the Gospels. In this session, we will begin looking at paragraph 14 in Dr. Fruchtenbaum's book, which he entitled In Bethlehem, and I add, Magi Visit Young Yeshua. Previously in Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 and 25, and in Luke chapter 2, verse 7, it mentions Yeshua's birth. Just like Luke talked about what happened after Yeshua's birth, now Matthew does as well in this section that we're going to look at. All right, as you see on the screen there, look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. It says, now after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Now Bethlehem, or Bethlehem, which in Hebrew means house of bread, was the birthplace of King David. So Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, a physical descendant of King David and the ultimate fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, was born there as well. The bread of life came to us in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Now, Judea was the Roman province, roughly equivalent to the previous southern kingdom of Judah. All right, let's continue looking at the verse. And then it says, in the days of Herod the king. Okay, so that brings up logically the question, who is this King Herod? This is referring to Herod the Great. Herod the Great was born into a rich and influential Idumean family. The Idumeans were largely descendants of the Edomites, who were descendants of Esau, one of Isaac's sons, and brother of Yaakov or Jacob. Now, the Idumeans lived south and to the east of the Dead Sea. During the Hasmonean rule in the 1st and 2nd century BC, the Hasmoneans, who were descendants from Mattathias, that was Judah Maccabee's father, conquered Idumea and forced them to convert to Judaism. Herod the Great's father, Antipater II, though an Edomite, converted to Judaism. He then followed a lot of the religious practices of the Mosaic law. For example, he forbade images of himself. It adhered to the dietary restrictions of the law and forbade the women of the family from marrying uncircumcised men. But his children, like Herod the Great, they were educated in Hellenism. Herod the Great came to power in 37 BC when he was installed as a client king ally of the Roman Empire. He ruled from 37 BC until 4 BC. As an Idumean, he was never accepted by the Jews as king. But Herod ruled with an iron fist, with Rome's full backing. Out of fear, the people had to submit, though at times some tried to rebel. Now, he's called the Great not because he was a great person, far from it. He's called the Great due to his many building projects of fortresses, aqueducts, theaters, and public buildings. He's probably most well known because he built the Second Temple there in Jerusalem, which was a magnificent structure and complex covering 35 acres. My understanding is he built this hoping that the religious Jews would finally accept him and appreciate him as king, but that wasn't the case. He also built Caesarea Maritima, which was on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And he built the Herodian, and Masada, which you've probably heard about that, as a fortress. Now, Herod the Great sadly was a ruthless leader, killing those he viewed as any threat to his rule. In fact, he was so paranoid later in life, he even killed his favorite wife, Miriam, and 3 of his own sons. Can you believe that? He knew that when he died, he was so hated by the people that no one was going to shed a tear for him. So, you know what this guy did? He ended up having all the chief people in Jerusalem imprisoned. And the day he died, he ordered that they all be killed so that people would be weeping on the day of his death. I mean, how sick can you get? Therefore, it isn't surprising to us that when he heard of a baby being born who was reported to be the king of the Jews, and therefore a potential rival to his rule, it doesn't surprise us that shortly after he would even murder babies as a result of that. Herod followed some Jewish practices, like not eating pork. And in light of that, Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, came up uh, with the following saying about Herod, and it traveled around. Here's what the emperor said. He said, "It's safer to be Herod's pig, since he didn't eat pork, than it is to be Herod's son, since he tragically would even kill some of his own sons." A few weeks before Herod the Great died, he changed his will. In line with that, when Herod died, his kingdom was divided among his surviving sons. Archelaus received authority over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So that was the biggest territory. Another son, Antipas, who came to be known as Herod Antipas, and we read about him in the Brit Hadashah, received authority over Galilee and Perea. And his other son, Philip, received authority over the northeast part of his realm. That was the Golan, all the way up to Banias at the base of Mount Hermon. All right, let me share the screen again. I just want to show you a picture here of Herod's family. I understand he had 10 wives, but only 5 of them, which you see on this diagram, actually had children that or grandchildren that came into play with the scriptures. And I mentioned before about his wife Miriam, the first, that he ended up executing. But you can see in terms of the sons that he had from these wives, and it's got on the diagram there where in the Brit Hadashah that they are referenced. Okay, you can go back and watch this on the recording. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen now. All right, let me go back. Actually, I do want to share the screen, but I want to show you. I just want to keep reading our scripture. Okay, so now the next part of the verse, it says, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Okay, so that's going to raise the logical question. What is this talking about? So let's look at that now. If you've ever seen a nativity scene or set, it will typically show the Holy Family in a barn or stable, and there's shepherds on one side and 3 kings on the other side, visiting baby Yeshua there. Well, let me just say, there's a number of problems with that. As we're going to see later, the Magi didn't visit the Holy Family in a stable or cave like the shepherds had. Also, the Magi didn't show up when the shepherds were there. In fact, as I'm going to be mentioning later, they showed up maybe as late as 2 years later. As well, let me just point out, we don't know that there were 3 Magi. Now, I will acknowledge Christian tradition in the West says that there was 3 Magi. And apparently that tradition came about because we're going to talk about 3 gifts that were given to the child Yeshua. And so they figured, well, one gift was from each of these Magi. So they said there must be 3 of them. Some Christian tradition has even come up with names for them, and maybe you've heard about these. They came up with the names Casper, Melchior, and Belshazzar. Now, there's nowhere in the Bible it says that, so we don't know that that was even their names. Some have even inferred that they represented represented three sons of Noah, so all the people of the world. Okay, now that's Christian tradition in the West. Now, if you're not aware of it, interestingly enough, Eastern Christian tradition says there were 12 wise men or magi. Now, again, let me just say, the biblical text never says how many magi there were. So we don't know for certain how many there were. We do know this. We know there was at least two or more. And the reason we know that is because the word magi is the Greek plural for magos. So magos would be a singular magi. The Latin for the plural is magi, and that's where we get the English from. All right, so again, we don't know for sure how many there were, but at least two or more. Now, since their arrival we're going to read about this, caused quite a stir in Jerusalem, it's possible that there were many more than two or three of them. Also, going back to like a typical nativity scene that might not be accurate, also the text never says they were kings. The word magi doesn't mean king. Okay, the Hebrew is mag, and magi refers to the high priestly caste of Persia, wise men of the Magian religion. I'm reading what different Greek lexicons would say. They would say a magi was a wise man or an astrologer of the Medes, Persians, Babylonians. Some would say a magician, astrologer. Sadly, astrology was common back in ancient times. All right, I'm going to quote here from Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He says they were experts in astrology, the interpretation of dreams, and other secret arts. Okay, I'm stopping my quote. It's very likely that no, actually, I am continuing the quote here. It is very likely the Greek term magoi, all right, that's the Greek plural of magos, is a translation of the Hebrew Hakim. Hakim means wise men, or usually is translated that way. This Hebrew word Hakim actually occurs in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, chapter 5, verse 7, and chapter 5, verse 15. Now, in those various verses there, it mentions several types of these chachim. It'll mention magicians, enchanters, or sometimes it translates it astrologers, sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners or soothsayers, depending on what translation you have. Okay, now I'm ending my quote. Now, astronomy, as you're probably aware, is a study of the stars or celestial bodies. Astrology is the study of some message or meaning of these celestial bodies or stars. So these Magi's were experts in both astronomy and astrology, not just looking at the stars, but in giving some meaning or interpretation to those stars. Now, possibly they were called wise men because they were believed to have insight or wisdom from this that other people didn't have. Also, they were called wise men because they were often consulted by leaders like kings and stuff about the future, about decisions. It says the Magi are said to come from the east, which is generally assumed by most biblical scholars to be referring to Babylon or maybe even Persia. Now, I did read where some think maybe they came from Arabia, but I believe it was more likely Persia or Babylon. Incidentally, in Jeremiah 39, verse 3, it mentions an official of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was of Babylon. It refers to this official as Rav Mag, which means chief of the Magi. Herodias, the Greek historian, said that that these Magi were a priestly caste of the Medes. Some believe they were actually kingmakers in Persia. No one could become king of Media Persia apart from their permission. Apparently, the most well-known and best astrologers were in the East. Let me just add this as no extra charge. You might remember the story in Acts chapter 8 about Simon the magician or sorcerer who wanted to buy the power to make the Holy Spirit come upon people when he'd lay hands on them. Well, he actually came to be referred to as Simon Magus, if you've ever heard that. Again, Magus is being the singular of Magi. So again, that just to show you it showed up even in Acts chapter 8. This group of Magi we're reading about in this story could have been a subset of the overall group that were actually seeking the true God through the previous godly influence of the prophet Daniel. You remember he had been taken into Babylonian captivity, and he was promoted and he was put over the Magi. And so some believe it's possible that maybe through his godly influence and that was passed down over 400 or 500 years to these Magi, that this subset of Magi that were coming to Israel looking for the King of the Jews, that they were actually some that were not involved with false gods, but actually seeking the true God. Undoubtedly, from the time that these Magi first saw the star and then interpreted it, there was some delay in time before they did something about it. Once they realized that they were going to go maybe trying to follow this star, it may have taken months for them to get prepared to actually leave so that they had, enough goods with them. And then it took many months to travel from Persia to Jerusalem. I believe that's roughly 1,000 miles. Or if it was from Babylon, I think it's 700 miles. In ancient times, when they had animals, they couldn't just travel directly across the Arabian desert, but they had to go up the Fertile Crescent. They had to go up along the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, and then they would bend down, like maybe going down through Syria or Lebanon, and then they would come into what we know as Israel. So all total, from the time when these Magi first saw the star until they arrived in Jerusalem, it's not surprising that it would have been about 2 years. Now, incidentally, the rabbis didn't look favorably upon the Magi. In fact, they spoke very negatively about them in the rabbinic writings. But again, I believe these Magi that came seeking the child Yeshua, these weren't the normal Magi. I believe these were more godly Magi. Incidentally, just in case that you happen to hear this, I did read an alternate theory by someone who believed that these men who came seeking the child Yeshua were not Magi or astrologers, but instead they were Hebrews in the area of Persia, left over there from the Babylonian captivity, and therefore they knew about these messianic prophecies that I mentioned, and they came from the east to pay homage to the King of the Jews. And when they saw it was the time for the Messiah to be born, they came looking for him. Now, let me just say, I don't believe there's any convincing proof of this alternate theory that these were Hebrews coming from Persia or Babylon, coming seeking the King of the Jews. I agree with the vast majority of biblical scholars that these were Magi, and they were therefore Gentiles, not Hebrews. Okay, so let me share the screen. Let's keep reading our verse. Okay, so it says, when the Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, they were saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Okay, let me stop sharing the screen. Now, that raises a logical question. why are Gentile magi from the east, let's say from Persia, concerned about a king of the Jews? Well, that's an important question. Let me just say, we see in our verse, here's one reason why. Let me just share the screen again. They said, "For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, in ancient times, a celestial object like a star or comet was commonly referred to as a harbinger or warning or indicator of something significant to occur, like a birth or a death. Though there have been various explanations given over the years as to what this really was. For example, I read where, one theory, they said, well, maybe it was a conjunction of the planets Venus and Jupiter in the sky, which just looked like one bright star. Let me just say, I appreciate people trying to come up with these explanations. Even if there was a natural explanation, we know that God was supernaturally using it for his purposes. But let me just say, I believe the best theory is to say that this was really a supernatural, quote unquote, star, or look like something supernatural that looked like a star. Notice that it says the star referred to, the Magi referred to as his star. Apparently, this star initially showed up, like I said, 2 years earlier. They saw it. Since it doesn't mention it again until a little bit later, a general view is maybe the star then disappeared. So they saw it at first, then it wasn't there. Others, and I've seen this in movies, that they see the star the whole time. They're following it while they're traversing from, let's say, Persia over to Israel. So it's possible the star appeared, that it disappeared, then it reappeared, it disappeared. We do see that this star, it moved from the east to the west. So from Babylon, Persia to Jerusalem. Now that's not unusual. But here is what is unusual. We're now going to see in a moment, it moved from the north to the south, from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Now that is against what normally would happen with stars. And then it says that this, and this is again why I'm saying it's supernatural, it came to stand or hover in some way over one particular home in Bethlehem. We're going to read about that in a moment in Matthew 2, or not in this section, but another video in Matthew 2, verse 9. Now, literal stars, as you know, are bigger than the earth. I mean, talking about the sun, maybe they're even bigger than our sun. They're very hot. So a celestial star couldn't literally stand over a particular home. So it's obviously figurative here. So maybe it's talking about a light was shining from this, what they're viewing as a star, is actually pointing to a particular home. All right. Well, anyway, that would be unique. So in whatever way it's focusing on a home, that would be unique for a star. So that's why I'm saying that this is something supernatural. This star probably was God's Shekinah in Hebrew, or Shekinah glory in English, or it was an angel appearing as a star. Remember, God's Shekinah glory appeared to the shepherds at Yeshua's birth in Luke 2, verse 9. So it's not surprising that it may appear here to guide these magi to Yeshua. So the first Jewish and Gentile people to come to Yeshua, that was initiated by probably God's Shekinah glory. But this raises a question. How did these magi come to associate a star that they saw up in the sky with the birth of a king of Israel? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay. Many years earlier, you might remember in Bamidbar or Numbers, many years earlier, Balaam, a well-known pagan prophet from the east, who was called by Balak, the king of Moab, he was called by Balak to curse Israel. Okay, so Balaam gave a messianic prophecy that involved a star and a scepter, so therefore a king. Look at, let's look at the verse. Look at Numbers 24, verse 17 there. So it says, now this is Balaam speaking. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. Notice this, a star shall come forth from Yaakov or Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab, and tear down all the sons of Sheth. So again, notice that this prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17, mentions a star that's associated with Jacob or with Israel, and it's associated with a scepter, which of course we would associate that as being something a king would be using to rule. And it says that scepter shall rise from Israel. So it's very likely, therefore, that Daniel had passed on this about Numbers 24, verse 17 to the Magi who were under him. Remember when he was over the Magi in Babylon, and that had been passed on to these Magi. Incidentally, this verse, Numbers 24, verse 17, was recognized as being messianic in Targum Neophiti. All right, now remember, I've said this, a Targum was an Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew scriptures. So that Aramaic paraphrase made it clear that this was viewed as being messianic. Okay, so I believe again, Numbers 24, verse 17 probably was passed down from Daniel to the Magi. Also, it's probable that the Magi knew the time frame of the coming of the Jewish Messiah, the King of Israel, due to Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, which actually explicitly mentions Mashiach, or the Messiah. And again, I believe Daniel would have passed on this to the Magi. So when the Magi knew the rough time frame of the promised Jewish Messiah was showing up, and then they see this special star, they associated that, it seems like they associated that star with a king of Israel being born. Now, when the Magi showed up, as it's recorded in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, they say, where is he who was born King of the Jews? Now, they didn't mention Messiah there, or at least that's not recorded in Matthew 2, verse 2. But it appears the Magi made it clear, or it was obvious, that this King of the Jews they were looking for that had been born, they're referring to the Jewish Messiah. And the reason that's clear is because we're going to see King Herod is going to associate this king with the Jewish Messiah. Now, for some reason, the Magi didn't know of the Messianic prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2 in our English Bibles, or in Micah 5, verse 1 in the Hebrew, where it mentions about the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. So as a result, and again, for whatever reason, they didn't know about Micah 5, verse 2, the Magi ended up going to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, the capital, and they asked there, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Now, let me just add, the scriptures, they forbid about astrology, and we don't talk about, what astronomical sign were you born under and stuff like that. Astrology, again, it's a belief that an understanding of the influence of the planets and stars on earthly affairs allows them to both predict and affect the destinies of individuals, groups, and nations. So we don't believe in astrology. The Bible is against that. Now, what I'm going to mention is not that kind of astrology. But I will say some believers, and I've heard some teaching on this, maybe you have, some believe that God could have intentionally tried to portray in constellations, signs up in the heavens, some of the biblical story. For example, the constellation Virgo pictures a woman that some have interpreted to represent the Virgin Mary or Miriam. So I share that to say, who knows now, maybe something like that could have come into play with these magi. But again, we're not talking about the kind of astrology the Bible forbids. Now, normally, and you don't worship a king, but for some reason, these magi wanted to worship this king. And I'll mention that in another segment that I'm going to video for this, which could maybe explain a little bit about why that was the case. But we can at least say at this point, the Magi knew this particular child that was born King of the Jews was extra special. So I just want to end this segment, but with some application. Notice that God can even use pagan astrologers for his purposes. Here, to mention to the leadership and the king of Israel about the birth of Messiah Yeshua. That just reminds us we see that God can even use unbelievers in our lives to help us or even give us good advice. Also, these magi were an indication that God's plan was not just for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles to worship and follow this King of the Jews, since the magi who came to worship Yeshua were Gentiles. Also, notice the one we follow is a king, and we are to worship this king, Yeshua. He is the rightful king of the Jews, and he is our king. He's King of Kings, and he's Lord of Lords. Okay, we're going to stop there. And let me just ask, if you like these teachings, please choose like on our YouTube channel for these teachings and share them with others that you think would enjoy them too. All right, this is the end of part 1. In part 2, that I'll also record this one of paragraph 14 in Bethlehem. We will continue looking at Matthew 2 verses 3 through 8. And then there'll also be a part 3, which will finish this one. So I hope you'll join us for parts 2 and part 3 of this series on paragraph 14 as well. God bless you until next time. Shalom.